Hi, everyone. As participants start to roll in, we're going to wait until about 6:05 to get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for waiting patiently. We're going to wait just a little while longer till 6:05, and when we'll officially start as people start to roll in. All right. Hello, and welcome to the second session of our second annual Ruby Jones Conference on Race, Social Justice, and Civic Leadership. The Ruby Jones Conference is brought to you by a sponsorship from State Farm Insurance, along with Westchester University's Dowdy Multicultural Center, the Center for Women and Gender Equity, the Office of Student Leadership and Involvement, and the Center for Civic Engagement and Social Impact. I'm Nate Hayes. I'm a senior nursing student and a leadership consultant at the Office of Student Leadership and Involvement. For those of you who were unable to join us earlier, this year the Ruby Jones Conference Committee decided to frame our time together as focusing each evening on one pillar of the conference's name. Tonight's focus is on race and grappling with the critical issues race plays in today's society. I'm honored to introduce the next speaker for our conference, Yeny Romero, youth organizer at Pennsylvania Immigration and Citizenship Coalition. Yeny and her family proudly carry Central American roots and decadence. Yeny has spent her formative years in the historic city of Reading, Pennsylvania, where she is now surrounded by a diverse community she calls family. Her passion for her roots and her experiences have led her to different roles for leadership in social justice and different human rights movements. She graduated from Reading Senior High School while being a DACA recipient in Pennsylvania and proceeded to attain her undergraduate degree at Alvernia University. In her role, Yeny supports the PICC in their mission to advance immigrants' rights and promotes immigrants' full integration into society by advocating with a unified voice for greater public understanding and welcoming public policies throughout Pennsylvania. A few technical notes before we get started. This is a Zoom webinar, so any questions you have for Yeny, please include them in the bottom option of your window that says Q&A. There will be some time at the end for Yeny to respond to your questions at the end of this session. If you're seeking for extra credit for a class, a link and a QR code will be shared at the end of this session for you to fill out the form to receive your extra credit. And just for a point of your information, the questions do have an anonymous feature if you would not like your name to be displayed. Tonight, Yeny Romero will provide an overview of the history of immigration in the United States and anti-immigrant policies. We will all gain a better understanding of the ways racist and xenophobic policies impact immigrant and refugee communities. Yeny will offer examples of ways that participants can advocate in support of immigrant and refugee communities. Please join me in welcoming Yeny Romero to the conference.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today. Thank you for that introduction to Nate. So we'll get started with today's presentation, which is going to be largely understanding American history and understanding, things that have happened as part of the American history that have built the world that we live in today, and that are continuously continue to affect the way that people are living their lives in the United States. And so, as Nate mentioned, right, the purpose of today's workshop is for us to understand some of the history around criminalization in the United States, as well as anti-immigration policies. I am here today with Pennsylvania Immigration and Citizenship Coalition. We are an organization that is formed through a coalition of 60 members across the state. PIC is committed to educating and engaging different allies and advocates so that we continue to fight and advocate for pro-immigrant legislation. We do have monthly conference calls in which we do continue to provide different resources and education. So if you are interested or curious at the end of this presentation, please do visit our website. It is www.paimmigrant.org, really simple. We do want to put a disclaimer out there that all presentations produced through PIC and different partners are for informational purposes and should never be used or constitute as legal advice. So We'll start right off with talking about the history of criminalization, right, which began since 1492. We know that the United States history, as well as the history of other countries through the Americas, did begin with colonization, right, as well as genocide and slavery. Since then, as the country has continued to build itself, we know, right, the United States is a fairly young country compared to the rest of developed nations. So we do call upon, right, that policies have been created throughout history to include and exclude specific populations based on demands for labor based on race, gender, class, different things like sexuality, as well as religion. But to really understand all of this, we do have to understand some of these terms that we are going to go through in the next couple of slides. For example, what does system mean? So system is a group of institutions and social relations and cultural norms that work together to function as a complex whole, right? Throughout this presentation, we are going to be referring a lot back to systemic issues, right, around racism. And so it is important for us to understand that systems are essentially what form part of, in general, the way that things function around us. We also must understand what power means, right? And power means the ability to control different circumstances. It will also be important for us to understand what privilege means, which actually means an advantage or benefit enjoyed by an individual or group. And so with that said, we'll begin right at 1492, right, where dating back, you will remember that there was the genocide of the indigenous people that lived in this continent. And this was, of course, we remember the voyage that Christopher Columbus took to the Americas. Columbus arriving and establishing the beginning of what is essentially white supremacy on American soil, including slavery of Black and brown bodies. This is necessary for us to know and to understand that this was a necessary component of colonization. Indigenous communities were killed through war, migration, disease, enslavement, and rape. We'll also have to understand, right, that this continues, right, through 1619 with U.S. slave trade beginning in Jamestown, Virginia, and continuing to be practiced over 200 years into that future, where we understand that we currently reside in a country that was essentially conquered, right, and also built by people who were stolen from their land and forced to work on plantations. So, right, we do acknowledge all of this has to be talked about in every circumstance when we are talking about racism, when we are talking about the history that the system that we live in has built around. And so we continue into the timeline you'll notice on your screen, right, all the different points. And not everything is on here, obviously, but these are specific points that we thought are important to point out. Once again, letting us reflect back upon the fact that the systems that we do operate under have specifically benefited groups of people and put others at disadvantages. So on this screen, excuse me for 1 second while I plug in my computer. Great. And I do see there is a, I'll address there's something in the chat box. Yes, that is a good point. It does say in the chat box that Portugal began African slave trade in the 1440s, right, adding to that, this falls into the history of, once again, enslavement, right, and genocide. So looking at this timeline, I do want to get, you know, participation from the audience. If, you know, if there are any questions that you would like to add or comments, please feel free to put them in the chat box. But once again, looking at these different points on this timeline, we'll look at the US signing the Declaration of Independence, right, from England, that stated that all men were equal, right? While at that exact point in time, still owning slaves and continuing the displacement and killings of indigenous populations, as well as denying basic rights to women in the country. So even though these words were written as part of the Declaration of Independence, we know now, we understand that it was far from the reality. Moving into the 1790s, right, and this specifically talks about the Naturalization Act and restrictions to citizenship. During that point in time, the Naturalization Act restricted citizens from a to a free white person, good moral character. Citizenship was permitted to those specific people, and also gave them the right to vote, own properties, file lawsuits, testify in court. Any foreign-born person of color were largely denied that until 1954. We also point out during that time period, 1998, that the Alien and Sedation Act allowed president's arrest and imprisonment or deportation of any non-citizen who may have believed to pose national threat. And then we have, of course, the Indian Removal Act, which was signed by President Andrew Jackson, which forcefully removed 15,000 Cherokee Native American citizens at gunpoint from the South to a reservation in Oklahoma. Over 5,000 people died, and this is known as the Trail of Tears. This became the first use of detention camps in the United States. We move on to 1850, where you'll see that the next point is the Fugitive Slave Act. which mandated the return and of any escaped slave without due process or any right to a jury or trial. These were found, those who helped find people who had escaped slavery opened the door to prosecute abolitionists, and these were activists who fought the practice of slavery. Anyone who participated in assisting the Underground Railroad was penalized. And then, of course, we enter 1860s to 1870s, where we see Jim Crow, right, and the imprisonment of former slaves based on criminalization of basic behaviors like loitering or unemployment. And further, we do see 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act. But in between then, there were several other accounts, right? Like, for example, 1861 to 1865, which was the Civil War, is fought over economic interest specifically, and not necessarily around the freedom of slaves. So we do see, right, in 1862, the Emancipation Proclamation, which legally freed slaves, although many slaves did not return, did not learn about it specifically for many years. By 1865, the 13th Amendment was signed, allowing the outlaw of slavery, except as a punishment for crime. So slave criminalization still continued into what now is known as the prison system. And so once again, continuing that cycle, even though it being called something different. I see there are comments in the chat, so let me check that before we continue. Okay. Yeah, I think we will touch on several of these points that I see are being asked on the chat, so we can come back to them at a different point. If we don't touch upon them, please remind me. And so once again, here continues a very long history. And of course, these are things that you might have briefly heard about, but of course are not the things that are taught in the history books. And once again, these are probably things that you might be learning in college, but you never really learned about them throughout K through 12. And you know, that is a systemic issue, and it isn't by any coincidence, right? Like there's reasons why you haven't learned about these things if you haven't heard about them yet. So we enter the post-industrial era in the 1990s. The US government implements the militarized strategy along the US border with the Operation Gatekeeper, Operation Safeguard in Arizona as well, and Operation Blockade Hold the Line in Texas, forcing migrants to cross through the desert. Thousands of people died and continue to die attempting to cross these borders thereafter. Through the 1990s through 2000s, the private prison industry boomed and burst as the crime rates decreased, which led to many different vacancies in the prisons. So new policies were implemented to an attempt to actually fill up these vacancies. During 1910 through 1940s, the Great Migration brought over 1 million to migrate to the South, to the North to escape Jim Crow laws and also lynchings. From 1916 to 24 to the 1990s, the U.S. military occupations of the Dominican Republic began. And there was U.S. Marines invading to prevent President John Bosch, who refused to sell of nationally owned sugar plantations and industries private to investors. We also see in 1917 on this timeline, right, that there was specific things that were required of people, like literacy requirements established specifically for migrants. And as well as in 1921 to 1924, which there was the National Quota Act that favored a specific kind of migration, which was European migration. In 1929, the U.S. Border Patrol is created, which induces specifically the separation categories to label either legal or illegal immigrants. In 1942 through 1945, we see the Japanese internment camps. In 1954, Operation Wetback resulted in over 3 million Mexicans deported over without any court hearings. In the 1960s through the 1970s, we do see, right, that there is a peak of the civil rights movement, as well as specific targets to infiltrate and imprison any activists, including the Black Panther movement, as a way to disorganize a growing resistance against the racism that we are addressing. And so we enter the post-industrialization era, as well as 9/11 to the present day. And I did not include 2019 within this presentation because we have all been living it. So in 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement goes into effect, which is known as NAFTA, leading to economic displacement, lower wages, and increase in migration from Mexico. Over 2 million small farmers at that point in time lose their livelihoods and lands as U.S. Subsidies for corn flooded markets and devalued domestic Mexican harvest prices. Formal employment opportunities shifted to temporary work, such as sweatshops at the border, and increased what was at that point in time income inequality. And then in 1996, we see illegal immigration reforms and Immigration Responsibility Act, which was known as IRA. That was passed in an effort to increase the detention of non-violent, non-criminal immigrants, and led to the deportation of migrants of minor crimes. It also raised the income eligibility requirements for petition sponsors, barred persons who cross the border without authorization, and applying for green cards from within the US. This also led to what we still know as different kinds of 287G programs, which are programs that allow ICE to collaborate with local police to increase their numbers in deportations. Right after that, we see the Patriot Act and Muslim Registry, which the FBI and INS are given broad powers to detain suspected quote unquote terrorists and arrest over 1,200 South Asian, Middle Eastern, and African migrants, holding them in unknown locations indefinitely without charges. And most are also deported. The Muslim Registry was specifically Arab, Muslim, and also South Asian men who were to be required to be entered into a specific special registration and then deported. This centralized immigration and law enforcement was what began the database that now exists, where others are now added onto those lists. The Department of Homeland Security was founded right after 9/11, ballooning the budgets for Border Patrol that birthed the Immigrant and Customs Enforcement Agency, which is also known as ICE, and the militarization of DHS. In 2008, there is what is known as Secure Communities, as COM for short, which is a deportation program that relies on the partnership of law enforcement agencies with ICE, allowing ICE access to information on individual arrests and held in jail throughout the database, to specifically contact with law enforcement agencies. ICE issues detainers requests for local agencies suspecting undocumented immigrants. In 2012, we see the introduction of Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which is DHS will not deport certain undocumented youth. Under the executive order granted specifically temporary protection for children of immigrants, but not of their parents. And then entering into, fast forwarding into 2018, we see that immigrants can be held by U.S. immigrant officials indefinitely without receiving any bond hearings, or even if they have permanently been granted legal status or seeking asylum. And that brings us to the end of the summary of all the different points in history. And there are several that we did not include in here, but we definitely wanted to flag all of these different pointers, just in case you haven't heard of these different happenings in the history of the United States. And so, which brings us to understanding the moment, which we have all been in, right? And understanding that specifically uprisings in the past and in the history have been the language of the oppressed. Every day, people of color in the United States are being criminalized for their economic conditions, their race, their immigration status, gender, and so much more. There is a pandemic of mass criminalization that is ravaging all different neighborhoods in our society. And so with this timeline, we come to relearn history, because once again, this is not the history that has been taught in schools, but the United States has history of racism and anti-Blackness. And so, you know, we do have to understand what this means, and what kind of systems it has created around us, so that we don't continue to recreate all of these systems that continuously oppress people of color and in different communities. So in this, right now, I'd like to bring attention to specifically the terms that are on your screen currently, understanding that the system of the United States operates under that oppresses people specifically is white supremacy, the system that gives white people power and privilege over the expenses of Black people, people of color, and also third world people. Following this is also some examples, but of course we have seen throughout the timeline several different examples of how this has come to happen. It is important that we know why we are in the current state today for immigration in the United States, as well as understand how history has created this narrative around immigration that criminalizes it. The United States history, as well as the history of other countries in the Americas, once again, right, bringing full circle, began with colonization, genocide, and slavery. Immigration law today is a product of white supremacy. Immigrant communities have benefited from past movements and uprisings as well. So we come back to make sure that we are pointing out these different narratives, understanding that we cannot say abolish ICE without also saying defund the police, and understanding really what that means. We bring back attention, right, to the uprisings that we have seen in resistance to racism in the systems that operate the United States. So we again bring forth June 12th in Atlanta. Rayshard Brooks, a Black man, is killed by police officers after falling asleep in Wendy's restaurant drive-through lane. On Monday, May 12th, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, a black man named George Floyd was killed by police. The police used a disallowed tactic in putting a knee on the neck of George. George Floyd died in a hospital after this. The same week, we saw Tony McDaines and Breonna Taylor also killed by police. On February 23rd, Ahmaud Arbery was killed jogging in a neighborhood near his house in Georgia. In this case, and a similar case was Trayvon Martin, Aaron Gardner, Michael Brown, and many more that have the same thing in common, right? That operated under racism that is embedded into and allowed, right, in the system. And so we often hear the different terms and different comments of not all police officers are bad. And while the important point there is that they work for an institution that has killed many people because of their race. And so this is once again going back to systemic racism, and this would be known as institutional racism. A lot of this information was retrieved from the Movement for Black Lives, which was created in 2014, but has been a movement that has been around for a long time. And so for more information, please do visit www.4bl.org. And so coming back to understanding history, right? We remember the words of Dr. Martin Luther King that say, a riot is the language of the unheard. And since slavery, the Black community in the United States is demanding equality and respect, but this country does prioritize private property over Black lives. The United States has laws that protect private property more than individuals. And this is important for us to understand when we refer to different terms like the economy, right, and private property. This is why people do organize and fight, right? Because they understand that in organizing, that is where power lies. And we remember that materials can be replaced, but a life can't be replaced. Once again, remembering that we are on stolen land that was built, and a country that was built by stolen bodies. So what do we do with all of the information that we have in front of us, right? Understanding the history, understanding all the different movements. We have to have conversations. Conversations are essentially what bridge the different gaps in understanding. And so we bring a reminder back to making sure that there is different spaces where people are having these conversations to allow there to be an understanding of different experiences that people are living in this country. The United States, as we have been speaking, right, has had many changes throughout the years, and all operating under the same systems. And so it is important that we identify these systems and that we do start making changes. And I think oftentimes we get discouraged in thinking that we cannot make an impact in the world that we live in because everything seems so overwhelming. So I'd pick, which once again is formed by 60 different organizations that form a coalition. The work that we do is around advocacy, civic engagement, and capacity building. Some of those specific things are education justice, making sure that those who are oppressed are still able to obtain education, enforcement resistance, which is centered around when these communities that are oppressed are under attack, that communities organize to make sure that they are resisting the enforcement of those oppressions. We also do organize around driver's license for all and workplace justice, as well as community navigator training programs where we train individuals to know their rights and to make sure that they can advocate for themselves and their communities. We also do youth organizing and a program that is also known as PA is Ready. And so I wanted to bring back around this term of advocacy, right? So advocacy is the process of educating decision makers about issues that are facing our communities or problems that they think should be made aware of, and attempting to influence the different outcomes of their decisions. Issues with education will provide lawmakers and other decision makers information about different issues. And so this is specifically, the work that we do to continuously try to influence the different powers that are in place, to make sure that we are fighting for equity, that we are fighting racism and also white supremacy. And we can only do this through making sure that we are putting people in power that are typically meant to be discouraged to not be in power, to not occupy spaces in Congress and the House, right, in different courts, to continue to shift the power dynamics and structures to essentially continue to create equity in the world that we live in. So this was our presentation. I would like to check and see the different questions that we have. This is also my contact information in the case that you want more information on specific areas of work that we do. And so, yeah, I'm looking at the chat box to see if there's any questions specifically that we can answer today.
Hi everyone. As we move into the Q&A portion of it, I just want to remind you to put your use the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and we'll save the chat feature just for comments and participation, just so no questions get lost or buried in the chat. And we'll start with this one question that was actually in the chat, but from this point forward, just use the Q&A feature. But this one says, would you consider the forced labor of ICE detainees to be slave labor? And how can this be legal if detainees are not technically considered to be part of the prison system?
Very good question. I would say that once again, when we talk about systemic racism, there has been from the beginning of the timeline where we saw when the different specific laws and acts were passed specifically designed for a lot of these things to be allowed, like what you are mentioning, right, in that question. And so when people say that our immigration system is broken, they are not kidding. There is extremely just complete disorganization of what is happening, allowing for a lot of injustices to happen.
All right, and our next question is also asking, how many countries around the world have criminalized immigration the way the US has?
I actually do not have a number.
All right, we also have, is the fight for immigrant rights any different from the fight for Black lives? If so, how?
Good question. I would say that specifically both movements are fighting for justice. I would say that the fight for and I add this to the presentation, right? The fight for Black lives, which stems from the civil rights movement, is a movement that has been around for so long, right? Ever since slavery. And so along with the fight that that was also Native Americans, right? Native Americans fight in the United States that continuously also continue to be, whose rights continue to be abused. Once again, are also movements who have been fighting for the rights of people to just survive, to just live. And so I would say that that's what they have in common. And if there is a difference in them, it's the time that they have been fighting.
And then we have here, defunding the police is a very polarizing issue. What's a suggestion you have for what we as individuals can do to get the police defunded and get more people on board?
That's a good question. I think that this comes down to specific communities and specific communities' asks around defunding the police. I think that different communities put out different plans that they would like to see within their communities. And so when you hear the term defund the police, you know, you automatically think literally of what the term says, but really intrinsically what it is pointing out is the systemic racism that is allowed in those specific workforces. And so it isn't just saying defund the police, it's looking into what it actually means and what will prevent people from dying on the hands of police.
All right, and we also have here, what are some barriers youth face when considering advocacy, and what are strategies to overcome these barriers?
Could you repeat that question?
Yeah.
A little bit.
So what are some of the barriers that youth face when considering advocacy, and what are some strategies to overcome these barriers?
Yeah, so I would say being myself, you know, having found my my specific home for activism, it all comes down to different interests, because there are so many different issues that are at hand. And so finding the issues that you are passionate about, and then starting to do the research of those who are already doing that work. And if they aren't, then starting that fight.
Awesome. And this question says, will there be a follow-up session specifically about the work of PA immigrant and what we can do to help?
We always have a lot of sessions, information sessions, and also ways to get involved. If you take down my contact information, I will forward a link for the different trainings. Also, if you visit our website, you will find different events that are posted on our calendar that you can follow up and look into. We also have several different toolkits that, that you can use for either research, for writing papers, for anything like that. You will find a lot of information at www.paimmigrant.org.
All right, and right now that's all the questions we have at this time, but if anyone has any more, please feel free to use the Q&A feature. All right, since we have no other questions at this point, I think this is a good point to end. I want to thank everyone for taking time out of their evening to join it with us. Yes, there will be a link after this. If you are attending for extra credit, there will be a link posted with a QR code. If you scan that, it will pull up a form and you can fill out, and that will count as your attendance for attending this portion of our conference. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you for hosting me.
All right, and this is the QR code link that you would use if you need the extra credit attendance.